Really nice. Okay, so today we talk about improving the privacy of meta-analysis estimators for privacy-preserving Cox regression. Just to give a quick outline of the talk today, so I will start off with a motivation for this project, and then I'll quickly go over meta-analysis as a privacy-preserving tool, and then I'll walk you through the steps that go into constructing the meta-stepper estimator, which is proposed in this paper. This will be followed by some applications and maybe like discussions. So multi-center studies are actually quite common in clinical research, especially when we are dealing with diseases that are of low prevalence, right? Or for example, if we have heterogeneity within the population, so multi-center studies become really appealing. And so in general, the objective of this study is to look at such multi-center studies, right? So in this figure, for example, we present that we present the setting that we look at. So basically, we have this multi-center setup where we have a distributed network, and each of these nodes, for example, could be a hospital, and we have a central site that is interested in doing the analysis. Of course, we impose some restrictions. So, for example, this center here could be a node, and they could communicate with each of the nodes, but the nodes are not allowed to communicate with each other. We also allow the nodes, for example, to share some aggregate level data. And the main objective is that we don't allow the nodes to share any individual level data. So we try to preserve privacy during analysis. So depending on the kind of distributed network that we have, typically data is partitioned into two different formats. One of them could be a horizontally partitioned network. Essentially, that is when we have different cohorts of patients. So this will be cohorts 1 up to 4, and we have the same kind of information that is collected among the cohorts, right? So this could be different cohorts visiting different hospitals for the same ailment, for example. The second kind of data partition that is also possible is when we have a cohort who visits different sites, right? So this could be a general practitioner, and this could be an insurance unit, and this could be a specialist. And so depending on how the data is partitioned, depending on how the data is actually partitioned, different privacy preserving methods would have to be proposed in order to put the data together for analysis. And so basically, over the years, various privacy preserving methods have been proposed to facilitate how the data is put together in order to carry out analysis. Broadly, we can classify this as some traditional methods. This will include anonymization. So basically, that just involves removing all the personally identifiable information from the data. This will be the anonymized data, and typically this could be distributed among this could be distributed to someone who is interested in doing analysis. You could also have control access, or maybe you can have data sharing agreements which would be legally binding. But these traditional methods have been shown to be not effective in terms of preserving the privacy of the patient. For example, if anonymized data is distributed, sometimes it is possible to re-identify people, for example, through a link attack. More recently, fancier techniques have been proposed in order to facilitate how privacy is preserved. For example, noise perturbation is frequently used in media tech. Typically, this involves, for example, generating synthetically private data and then distributing that. In medical research, however, distributed regression and meta-analysis are more popular. Some of our previous work has been on distributed regression techniques for logistic regression. We extend that to meta-analysis in this setting. So we look at meta-analysis as a privacy-preserving tool. Okay, so just to quickly go over meta-analysis as a privacy-preserving tool. So we focus on horizontally partitioned datasets, right? So in this example, I have a horizontally partitioned data coming from 3 different hospitals. So you have hospital A, B, and C. And the data set of choice that we choose to work with is time to event data. So we have a group of covariates and time to event. So when the event happened and the time, right? So we can think of a longitudinal data. And meta-analysis in this context, if we assume we have an underlying effect of interest, so meta-analysis in this context would be, say, we can have each of the hospitals estimate the effect that is of interest along with the associated standard error. And they could be combined together through some weighting technique here. And in meta-analysis, the preferred weighting method that is often used is inverse-variance weighting. Other weighting techniques such as weighting by the sample size could also be used. But for the purpose of this work, we focus on inverse-variance weighting. It has some really nice properties. We know that it is unbiased. We know that these estimators that we get from each of the sites are the maximum likelihood estimators. So it is still unbiased, and we know that it is also the minimum variance among all of the estimators that we put together. So despite all of these nice properties that we get from meta-analysis, it has some major drawbacks. One, for example, we get this reduced efficiency because we know we're combining some aggregate level values, right? If you have heterogeneity within the population and you are estimating the effects from each of the sites, it is also difficult to account for this. It is much easier if we could have access to individual level data, yeah? So the main objective of this study is actually to improve the efficiency of the meta-analysis estimators and to also be able to produce some consistent estimators with the best possible variance. So so one method, so we borrow an old concept. So one-step estimators, they've been around for quite a while. They go as far back as Fisher in the 1920s. So one-step estimators could be used to improve the efficiency of an estimator. We have some preconditions. So for example, the starting estimator must be consistent. So what I mean by consistent is that the estimator basically converges to the true value in probability, provided we have enough samples, and it is also inefficient, right? So its variance is somehow greater than the best possible variance, right? And so if we are doing some estimation, right, and we are estimating the parameters through an iterative process like Newton-Raphson, then we know that each iterative step is actually an improvement. So it turns out that under this setting, we can get the best possible variance by doing only one iterative step, right? And so that is essentially the one-step estimator. The proof for this is not shown, but essentially to show the consistency of the starting estimator is fairly straightforward. We know that it is a weighted value of maximum likelihood estimators, and to also show the efficiency, to show the asymptotic equivalence between these two, it's not too difficult to also show. But the proof is not presented here because of space and time. And so next thing I have to go over is the estimator that we propose in this method. I'll do a step-by-step rundown very quickly. So the first step really involves where we do meta-analysis, right? So it is the weighting stage. So in our distributed network, each of the nodes start by estimating an initial value, a maximum likelihood value, along with its variance. And they're put together through weighting, right, to obtain a starting meta-analysis estimate. The next step basically involves transmitting that estimator back to each of the nodes, right? So this beta tilde is sent back to each of the nodes. This is still privately preserved. We never, not at any stage do we require individual data from any of the sites, right? So we transmit this beta tilde back to the site. This is followed by the site doing computing the first two gradients. So the site will evaluate the first two gradients. And then transmit back the vector of gradients along with this information matrix evaluated at the meta-analysis estimator back to the central site. So the first really, now the central that is conducting the analysis doesn't have to deal with any of the nodes anymore. So this is the update step. So basically, this involves the sites basically combining all of the gradients and the information matrices together and then doing the one-step update. So we can get this update done, right? So I have gone through the step implementation of how the estimator is constructed. Now, depending on the likelihood that we are working with, the gradient and the feature information, or the inverse of the feature information, it would be a little bit different. So just to show how it is constructed in this setting, right? So for the course, we assume, I use standard notations throughout. We assume a time to event data, right? So a group of covariates, some event status along with time, the time when the event happens. If we assume a Cox proposal hazard model, the standard partial likelihoods would be written in this form. And all that I need to show is that for the gradients, right, we can rewrite them in terms of some previous terms and then work our way around and get this expression for the scores, basically. Following the similar technique, we can obtain an expression for the feature information. And then for the estimator that is proposed, the one-step estimator that is proposed, we get this expression here. It looks a little bit bulky, but to make this easy for people who are doing analysis, what we do is we write a very simple script that could be used by each of the sites to derive the gradient and the scores, basically. And essentially, all that I wanted to show here is that we know at the start of the process, each of the sites have a featured value, right, to obtain maximum likelihood estimate. So they use that in combination with the aggregate, along with the pool data that is supplied to them, in order to compute the site-specific information metrics and scores. And this is what they transmit back to the central node who is doing the analysis. Now, given that we've gone through how the estimator is constructed, the next thing is to look at some application of this proposed method. So to start off, we simulate some survival time data. For this particular example, I set the event prevalence to about 50%. Covariates, I considered only two covariates generated from a binomial, bivariate normal. And we set the hazard ratios to like 0.8 and 2, right? So on either side of the null. And overall, the sample size was like 1,000. This was simulated for about 500 data sets. And so you could see that in both, for both estimated parameters, we compared 5 different models, right? So we compared individual level data model. So that is essentially when we assume that is the gold standard. That is when, if we could put all of that data together into one data file and do analysis, that will be this individual level data, right? And since we only simulated 2 sites, the data set was partitioned into two sites. So this will be site one, only site 1, only site 2. The meta-analysis would be a combination of the two and the proposed estimator. So you could see that in all simulation settings, basically, we have an improvement. We have lower standard errors for the proposed estimator in comparison to the meta-analysis estimator. And the efficiency also improves. And what is really encouraging also is that we still do not lose on any coverage, right? So irrespective of the number of simulations, we still fall within the 95% confidence interval coverage. Similarly, for the second effect estimate to our hazard ratio, we also see a similar trend improvement in performance. So this is really encouraging. So the next thing that I wanted to look at was to see how sample size affects efficiency in general. Because really, the goal is to improve efficiency, especially in small to medium samples. So we start with around, so we start from low samples, cranking it all the way up. So you can see that, you can see that throughout, especially for low to medium samples, the proposed estimator shows an improvement over the meta-analysis estimator. And this is true for both covariates. Similarly, we wanted to check how correlation affects performance. So it was a bivariate covariate, right? So multivariate. So what I did was basically increase the correlation between the two of them, and you can see as we begin to get highly correlated data sets from 5 upwards, the meta-analysis begins to behave like it falls down quite quickly. In contrast, the proposed one-step estimator is almost unaffected by correlation between the covariates. And then also, since the proposed model likelihood that we are looking at is Cox likelihood, so we also varied the baseline hazards. And throughout, you can see consistently the proposed estimator shows an improvement of meta-analysis. So finally, I mean, we know in terms of simulation, it works quite well. To show how this performs in real life, we took a minimal data set, a small data set of PSC, like an old trial from the 1980s. It included only 312 participants, and these people were followed over time. And the outcome was basically whether they were censored, they had a transplant, or they died. And so time was from the time of enrollment up to when they experienced the event, and they were given either the treatment or the placebo. And so basically the covariates of interest here were treatment and stage, like histology stage. And so similarly, okay, so this data set is actually from 2 different sites. So we wanted to see how different the sites were. They're quite similar overall. You can see how many people are dying in between. And so in terms of the result itself, so we again see that the proposed estimator is an improvement over meta-analysis, and it's quite close to the optimal value throughout. Okay. So just to give some conclusion, like some remarks at the end, the proposed estimator works quite well. For small to moderate samples, it improves over meta-analysis. It still retains the high degree of privacy because we are only working with aggregate values. It is consistent and asymptotically efficient, so it preserves all of the nice properties that we get along with the maximum likelihood estimators that were included in meta-analysis. And it is also non-resource intensive, so minimal contribution is required from the sites that are involved. So with that, I would like to thank my supervisors, Paramita and Anna, and the team at the CIFA lab. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lamin. Very interesting work. Thank you. And questions? Questions for Lamin?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yep.
I might have missed this. In your simulation study, I think I didn't quite follow the part where, did you happen to do a estimation to compare efficiency versus prevalence? Because I think you just set your prevalence to 0.5, right?
Yeah.
Do you think the prevalence of the disease would play a role in your performance?
So we in the paper itself, we considered different prevalence values, and we also varied the prevalence irrespective, especially in like small, like when you have small prevalence, it works quite well. So you consistently see improvement even with small prevalence.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I did not show that result yet because of space, but yes, it works well.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Lamin, your coefficients in the simulation that I saw were linearly modeled on the log hazard. Does the same properties of the estimator hold true if you start looking at nonlinear relationships on the hazard function?
So okay. So the simulations did not consider non-linear functions, but I suppose it should be fairly. I mean, yeah, this is something we haven't tried, but it is definitely worth considering, I would say. But I don't anticipate it should work any differently.
Are there other questions for Lamin? Yep, Lucas.
So you mentioned that like the inverse of the Fisher information matrix is the best variance you can do for an estimator that is consistent. I know that true for unbiased estimators, but why do you say that that also is true for consistent estimators?
So I think I assume that would have been clear. So I should say the weighted estimator that I was constructed was from the maximum likelihood estimate, right? So you get unbiasedness from that. But yeah, I mean, it's in the details. I should have made it more clear. But yeah, but it's a way of the maximum likelihood estimate, and that is carried through. So yeah, all of them are. I mean, I should say that the meta-analysis estimator is in fact the minimum variance unbiased estimator. So you still get all of these nice properties, by the way.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? All right, then we'll thank Lamin very much for a wonderful presentation.